Every day's a good time. Sun coming up outside. No one this time. Saturday's child stays home. Say so wrong. Well, another day. Grocery store, just making not to put a tree, just let it be. No words and looks can't see. Good afternoon, college students. Hope you had a good weekend. Let's see. So yeah, you have a test this week. It's going to be a couple essay questions that you'll start working on Thursday. My plan is on Wednesday to have basically a post with the notes that might help you, the PowerPoints basically, or keynotes I should say. So those will help you because you can use notes and resources to answer these questions, which should make it easier, but may also be a decent amount of writing to answer these. So I'll kind of give you the idea, of what direction the questions are without, this is a little bit different. We're not going to do a detailed test review like we did when you were sophomores. So this is a little bit different than that. Okay. Today, lecture does continue for you, so I'm recording this. I didn't finish the lecture from the other day, so you may have noticed I added to that post with a PDF, so it gives you some additional notes on the colonies that maybe you could use for your test essay coming up. What I'm going to talk to you about today is colonial slavery, so I'm just going to kind of focus on that because I know I'm going to have a question on labor, right? I know one of the questions is going to deal with labor, which we've talked quite a bit about in nearly every chapter, so I think that makes sense. So I wanted to make sure that you had some notes, some content on colonial slavery. So what I'm giving you is kind of the middle of one of my lectures from the past. This is in the middle of a lecture where I talk about the middle to lower colonies. Okay, so I'm presenting, I'll post this whole PDF just so you have it as a reference if you need it for your test on Thursday and Friday. But I just want to present the colonial slavery part of it. But I used to do a lecture on the middle colonies and the southern colonies. And so what I did over the weekend is I looked at the colonial slavery slides and kind of revised those. And so that's what I'll be presenting to you today. Okay. And this is being recorded for those who maybe can't be here or don't get all of it. I will expect a comment on it. And I did post the other one late Friday. It took a while to download for whatever reason. And I went to another commitment and I got back later that night. I'm like, oh yeah, I got to post that, it was Friday night and all that. So, but I see many of you responded to it, so that's good. Okay. All right, so let me get started here. So let me share my screen. So it's going to be me rambling at you again today about colonial slavery, but we are going to have a conversation about it tomorrow based on two things I found over the weekend. I found a video I want to show you, short video, like 5 minutes. So we'll do that tomorrow. And then there's a primary source from Sullivan Northrop, who maybe you've heard of. He's the main character in 12 Years a Slave. Maybe you've seen that movie, maybe you haven't. But I want to take a look at those with you guys tomorrow. Okay. So there's a video and a primary source. I want to continue to discuss some of these things tomorrow through that. Okay. And you don't even have to look at those tonight. Oh my gosh. You guys are really looking out with homework lately. It's probably because I'm lecturing you so much. So I want to cut you a break on the homework. Okay. So this lecture, if you title stuff in your notebooks, when you're taking notes on this, you could just title it Colonial Slavery, right? A lot of it's from chapter 4, but some of it's from the old text for this course, and then some of it's just stuff I've added that I know or other sources I use, right? I don't just use the textbooks, so kind of like you guys. All right, so let's kind of review for a moment. This slide should be review for us because we've talked about this quite a bit. Okay, so the key question here is why switch from servants to slaves? And we talked about this quite a bit. We talked about this in some chat rooms. You guys shared information. Well, the first thing is slaves are slaves for life, right? There's no indentured servant promise. There's no like time's up, your servanthood is done, right? Okay, this is an investment that you have for life. You can work this person to death, okay, right? So, it's just a longer investment, I guess, so to speak, a longer owning of labor. There becomes an incentive in South Carolina. Now, slavery is going to be introduced on a mass scale, plantation slavery in South Carolina. Slaves were brought to Jamestown in 1619. That's why the New York Times released a 1619 project earlier this year, which there's a lot of good stuff in that project. There is some controversy to that project. Some of that controversy is overstated. Some of the critics have gone too far, calling it complete revisionist history. That's really not the case. There's a lot of good stuff in it, but there's some things where they go too far that I agree with. For instance, I don't like some of the things they say about Abraham Lincoln. Maybe that's a personal bias, but they just kind of point out, some of his more prejudicial statements and ignore the good things. I don't like it when projects do that, but there's a lot of good stuff in that project. But that's why they titled it the 1619 Project, because of, that's when slaves first came to America. But they're really introduced on a mass scale in South Carolina. So South Carolina has the dubious distinction of being, the birthplace of plantation slavery. And the reason for that is because of rice. Rice is going to be a prominent crop in South Carolina, which tragically for Africans make them more attractive because they had knowledge of rice cultivation, something they'd been doing, okay? And they also had immunities to the diseases associated with rice cultivation. Okay, malaria and yellow fever, mosquitoes, rice, I don't know what you know about it, but rice is grown in water. It soaks in water. It's like rice patties, rice. You sort of share a lot of this with Vietnam and Asian countries, right? Rice it's in water almost all the time. So that's going to breed mosquitoes, right? So malaria and yellow fever are very key here. And many Africans had natural immunities to these diseases. So tragically for Africans, that makes them very an attractive labor source. And then remember, and we've talked about this, and then remember the issue with Native Americans are they don't have the immunities to these diseases. They don't have the immunities to European diseases. They're dying off in very large numbers. They're dying through slavery itself. They're being worked to death. They're dying through disease, and they're dying through warfare. And then when you get to the mainland, Native Americans are tough to enslave because, the North American continent is so huge. They've got a lot of places to retreat to. Right here, you're taking Africans from a continent they know, right, and taking them to one that they don't know. It's just tougher for them. It doesn't mean that there weren't attempts to escape. There were times African Americans joined Native American tribes or were adopted. That did happen. It was just tougher to do so. You don't have the organized groups to wage war the way Native Americans do. Okay, so it's just they're easier to enslave in this particular case than Native Americans were. And then remember, I also wanted to remind you, because we spent some time talking about this, I wanted to remind you about Bacon's Rebellion and how that had caused elites in southern colonies, particularly Virginia, to be aware of the fact that, hey, these indentured servants, we can't keep giving them land. We need large plantations. They're dissatisfied. They're causing problems. Let's create a race-based slavery where we separate these two groups of peoples, black and white, and neutralize the effects of white rebellion in that respect. Okay. Now, there'll be so many. What's interesting to, or what may be interesting to you, is that by the 1710s, remember the United States is going to be founded in 1776. But by the 1710s, blacks will outnumber whites in South Carolina. Okay, there'll be more African Americans in South Carolina than white. They're all enslaved, right? Maybe occasionally freed. I'm not sure about that by 1710, but there probably were some slaves that could be freed by then through the benevolence of masters, perhaps. Okay, but by 1710s, blacks were outnumbering whites in South Carolina. There's a book written about this. I like to bring up books just in case maybe you like to read like me, but there's a book written about this called Black Majority by Peter Wood, and it describes basically the culture that had been created in South Carolina, in which there was a black majority being controlled, by white elites, is the best way to put it, white elites and their employees. And this is an interesting dynamic, right? And it's going to create, in many respects, a fearful situation, right? Which I'll get to in a little bit. Okay, so slave trade, you guys know a lot about this. Maybe you remember this, maybe you don't, but this is the largest forced migration in human history. It's going to involve about 10 million Africans. Just a huge forced keyword migration. You know that they're packed like cargo. This is perhaps an image you've seen before. This is a typical slave vessel, and all these little, I don't know how well you can see it, but all these little dark marks here, right? Each of these represents a human slave. And this is a diagram. So this is a diagram that's been designed to show a slave captain, right, and his crew how many people they can get below decks and store to maximize the shipment of your product. But these are people being stored for weeks on end with occasional, sometimes they would bring them up above deck and exercise them, right? But they're being stored for weeks on end together in incredibly cramped conditions. No plumbing, just laying there in their own feces and things like that. Just horrible experience, unimaginably horrible, right? So this trip from Africa to the New World came to be known as the Middle Passage. It's the Middle Passage of the triangular slave trade, where goods from Europe went to Africa to trade with slavers. Slavers gave slaves, and slaves were taken to the New World, right? And then goods from the New World went back to England. So you had that triangle. I'm making a triangle here, that triangular slave trade, which maybe you remember reading about in junior high. But this is considered the middle passage of that journey. Okay. Here's a map for you that kind of demonstrates the forced migration of Africans. If you'll notice, the West Coast, which is sometimes called the Rice Coast, is the key coast here, right? Most Africans going to the Americas are from West Africa. You might notice also that the Ottoman Empire slave trade there's an investment in that as well. So many Africans had gone to the Ottoman Empire. They had a thriving slave system too, although not as cruel as the one that was developing the Americas, but still not fun by any means. Okay, so you can see these origins. So there, I think, let me make sure there's no other points I want to make about that map. Nope. Okay, so some things about it, and some of this we may have talked about again already, probably some new things here, but slavery had been, sometimes defenders of this will say, well, the Africans enslaved people for centuries. And well, that's true. It had been common in Africa. It was common before the Portuguese became involved, but it wasn't as cruel. It wasn't as cruel, and it wasn't about profit. And the slave trade that existed in Africa for centuries before the Europeans got involved, the way it worked was it was usually a war situation, or there were debtors working off their debt, or there was a sentence for crime, kind of like forced labor in our prison systems now, which by the way, some books have been written saying that basically that's a modern day form of slavery we still have in this country. Interesting. There's some articles and books on that, but so this was, slavery was seen as a punishment. It was seen as temporary. You did your time and you were released back to your people, right? Okay. It became a permanent condition with European involvement, and it became a profit motivation for European involvement. Now, there is some truth to the fact that the African kingdoms got us caught up in this profit margin, right? There were African kingdoms who wanted to rule over other African kingdoms and did capture slaves and bring them to the coast and give them to European traders. That's absolutely true. These were African kingdoms. But of course, that doesn't happen without the strong desire, the profitability of European slavery being introduced into these cultures. Okay. Let me know if I go too fast, guys. And I already kind of mentioned this, but yes, you had African slave traders. They marched captives in chains to the coast, and they waited to waiting European ships. So what's going on here is somewhat of a power struggle, because what's happening is you have some kingdoms in Africa that kind of like why Native Americans would side with colonial expansion at times, because they wanted to gain power in a particular region, or maybe they had long-term enemies, things like that. So what's happening is these African slave traders, what they're doing in many cases is they're capturing slaves, marching them to the coast, getting European goods and weapons in particular, right? So what we see is that arms race of musketry being introduced in North America. We kind of see some similar parallels in Africa, maybe before the musket, but probably into the development of the musket too, I would say. Where, you know, you've got African kingdoms where, okay, if I capture a certain amount of slaves and give them to these European traders, I'm going to get guns, I'm going to get this, I'm going to get that, right? So it was a way to increase power in one's kingdom and perhaps weaken rivals or adversaries, or just weaken other kingdoms because of your desire for power. So that's not a unique, you know, human societies tended to want that. And what enters into it is essentially greed and profit. And when that enters in, you know, things turn bad for certain groups of people in many cases. A little bit more about the Middle Passage. I guess I kind of mentioned this, but crowded, unsanitary conditions, people treated as cargo, ships designed to haul as many as possible, staggering death rate on the voyage of 10 to 20%. You know, basically, people would die in these cramped conditions, and you're living in feces. So, you know, a successful voyage was if you only lost 20%, right? So they understood that they were going to lose some, 10 to 20%. That's okay, right? People just thrown overboard. Sometimes people still alive or sick were thrown overboard. Anybody that was rebellious might be thrown overboard. Some people committed suicide. And there's a video tomorrow that's going to give you some more detail as to why that is. So I'll save that for the video. Now, obviously, some of the suicide was just despair. Right? You've been taken from your homeland, and you just don't want to, you know, you're just despairing. So hoping for a better life in the afterlife in some cases, of course. Okay. Anything else I can point out here? To me, one video I watched recently, which I don't think I'm going to show you tomorrow because it's a little bit longer, but to me, there was a great quote by a professor in that video that the Middle Passage demonstrates the staggering lengths that people will go to deny other people of their humanity for the sake of profit. I thought that was a powerful quote. Okay, so let's get back to South Carolina. So what are the conditions in South Carolina? They're unique because South Carolina is really going to kind of become big with rice. Some of your other colonies, you don't see rice development as much, if at all. You know, tobacco in Virginia is big. Cotton's going to, of course, develop and take over much of the southern plantations. So it's unique in that you've got rice, and the type of work often involved rice cultivation. And it's also unique, once again, because blacks outnumbered whites. So there's a concern here, right? Control. You want this labor force, but you've got this labor force that may not be too happy with you. So you got to, control is important, right? You know, imagine being on a plantation and you're surrounded by all these people that you're trying to control, right? And who may not like you very much. So that can be scary at times, but you need that workforce and you're profiting from it. So what happens? What types of systems are put in place? One is the task system, okay? And these are work patterns that tended to exist in the lower South, and maybe the lower parts of South Carolina as well. And talking about some other states in general here, other southern states, but slaves were given a task each day. Once completed, their task was over. So that was not as bad a system, okay? On a daily basis, slaves often did not work closely with whites. So the task system is, okay, here's your task, get her done, and then you're done. And what could be nice about the task system is, if you were a slave who were given these type of tasks, is depending on your master, of course, sometimes you could be farmed out to other plantations to work. And sometimes that may just be for the benefit of the master. But there were also cases, once again, depending on the master, all masters were corrupted by this system and did horrible things. But some are more horrible than others, and some are more benevolent than others. Some masters would allow slaves to employ themselves, even make money, and eventually purchase their own freedom. Like if you could earn your worth, right? Like if you're a slave valued for $1,200 and you could make that, save up that much money, eventually you could give your master that money and purchase your own freedom. I mean, think about all of that, right? You have to buy yourself out of forced labor, but that was seen as benevolent, right? So sometimes in the task system, that was more likely. because you may not necessarily be working dawn to dusk. Okay. The gang system is the one that maybe you're most familiar with. And this is going to become more and more a part of the Deep South with cotton, this type of system. Okay. Rice in South Carolina kind of begins this type of system, but cotton is really going to bring this type of system on, where slaves worked in smaller groups under the watchful eye of whites. So here you're working from sunrise to sunset, and you've got an overseer who's kind of watching your every move. So there's less independence in the system, if there's any independence in slavery. This is the one that we tend to associate with when we think of slavery. Okay. Some of this is maybe very repetitive for you guys, but slaves are bought and sold like animals, worked long hours, could be whipped for no reason. I mean, the thing you have to think about in a slave system is, and I probably brought this point up to you before, is what are the incentives to work, right? You know, like in my job, I have incentives to work. You know, if I get more credit hours, I get more pay, right? If I teach well, I get a favorable evaluation, and I get to teach the classes I want instead of, you know, being assigned to, you know, there's incentives, if that makes sense to you, right? You guys are probably going to have jobs where you have incentives. You do this, you get promoted, you get a pay raise, things like that. Slavery, there's none of that, right? I mean, maybe you have a master who will let you hire yourself out and save up money to buy your freedom. I guess there's some of that stuff, but there's, in most cases, there's not, you know, the only incentive is to avoid being whipped, right? So whipping is the number one motivator to get people to work, right? So, and that's tough. I mean, studies after study indicate that positive reinforcement is more of a motivator than negative. Not that you shouldn't use negative sometimes, but, you know, if you're just in a constant negative reinforcement environment, you're going to get depressed, and you're not going to be as productive, and then that's going to lead to even more whipping. So, you know, this is why the brutality of slavery could come about. They lived in shacks, they ate corn, they got salted pork, and this is a day-to-day routine, right? So you're not eating the healthiest of meals either, right? So there is obviously some overhead to slavery, and sometimes plantation owners, when they would compare their labor systems to those in the North, well, we take care of our slaves, we give them a dwelling, and we feed them, and we give them clothes, right? But it was, you know, you're trying to cut costs. You know, you're not giving them, you know, they're sleeping on the floor, they're wearing the cheapest clothing possible, they're, you know, not being fed steak dinners every night, you know, so it's, you know, come on. Anyway, now what's extraordinary, and maybe this is stuff you don't know, what's extraordinary is the ability of African peoples, and really all peoples in history, oppression or not, but the ability to maintain traditional heritage. There are things that groups of people develop in their cultures that they're very proud of, right? And they maintain, okay? And despite the controlled environment of slavery, and despite the efforts to split up different tribes, one of the reasons that it was difficult for Africans to rebel is they were intentionally separated from those who might speak the same language, right? So that prevents, that makes rebellion more difficult. But nevertheless, we see these African heritage traditions persist into the modern times, right? Children were given African names. We still see that now. Okay, there are some prejudiced whites who like to make fun of them, right? Unfortunately, but we still see the African names in much of African culture now. Music tended to reflect African origins, right? And think about the traditional music and African American heritage. Much of American music, its roots are in African music, from jazz to rock to blues to rhythm and blues. All of that is rooted back very much so to African music, right? The African cultures and the European cultures all have very awesome things about them, heritage-wise, you know, whether it's foods or music or whatever, what have you. But traditionally speaking, African culture is a little bit more expressive. European culture is a little bit more puritanical and reserved, right? So that more expressiveness in African culture might lend itself more to creative arts and music and performing, right? And we see African Americans dominate a lot of those areas, quite frankly, in American society today. Okay, there was a language that was created, a language made up of English and African words called Gula. So these efforts to try and split up groups didn't always work, right? So they kind of pull African word here, English word there, fused it together so they could communicate with each other, right? Now, I mentioned the difficulty of having rebellion. It doesn't mean there wasn't resistance. Sometimes students will ask me, well, geez, there were more African Americans in South Carolina than white. Why didn't they rebel, right? Well, it's difficult to rebel, but the answer is they did rebel, okay? There are ways they resisted. So there's kind of like three categories of resistance that I'm trying to point out on this slide here, right? Completely submissive and obedient with small number. Most slaves are not completely submissive and obedient, who just, yes, yes, sir, yes, sir, yes, sir, yes, sir, work really hard, did everything they were told, right? Most slaves are not like that, okay? Completely resistant is also small in number, right? So to be completely resistant, and most slaves were not like that because of the consequences. Severe punishment, sometimes death. So to be completely resistant, there weren't a lot of those either, okay? But subtle resistance, that little bit of resistance, that passive aggressive resistance, right? Quite a lot of that, quite a lot of that. Let me see if I can give you some explanation here. And some of you may know more about this than I do based on research you've done in the past. But how do you subtly resist in a slave situation? You break stuff. Oh, master, I'm sorry, I broke my hammer again, right? Okay. Or you get sick. Now, don't get me wrong, there were a lot of overseers who weren't too sympathetic to sick people, but come on, sometimes you can fake an illness really good. You can make yourself throw up and stuff like that, right? Okay. And maybe we've all taken a sick day when we, didn't really need to, right? Okay. That sometimes happened. You can fake an illness. It had to be pretty convincing in the case of slavery, but it was done. Pretending not to know English. I don't understand. What are you trying to say? Right? Pretending not to know how to use tools. Okay. So these are subtle forms of resistance. Now you had to be careful here because sometimes there were impatient overseers who beat people for not knowing how to do things, but every situation is different. Okay. And then of course there was escape for short periods of time. Not easy to do, and you often faced some consequences on your return, but it offered a brief reprieve, right? And obviously there could be incentives for escape. If you were married or you had children on another plantation and you had been separated through sale, and that plantation wasn't incredibly far away or not too far away, there's incentive to sneak off at night and go see your family, right? And even if you're going to get punished when you get back, those moments with family are precious, right? And maybe you can get back and not get punished, right? So there would be short periods of escape. Now, there were instances of outright resistance, okay? And I'm gonna close with the Stoner Rebellion. So let me tell you the story and then I'll shut up for the day. Now, there were several slave rebellions in United States history, colonial history. Most of them, of course, well, all of them really were unsuccessful, but they may have had some temporary success within them. Stoner Rebellion is a little bit like that, although very short-lived. So we're talking about South Carolina, birthplace of plantation slavery in the United States. Whites are in constant fear of a major rebellion. In 1739, their fears came true. So let's look at the setting, let's look at the context. It's going to take place in Charlestown, now Charleston, right? The capital of South Carolina. Great city to visit these days. Also the birthplace of plantation slavery. Okay. There was a yellow fever outbreak in that town, and this yellow fever was plaguing many of the white people, right? Many white people. So this was an astute rebellion in that the leaders of this were thinking, hey, this is the time to do this, okay? There are also hostilities going on between Spain and England at the time, okay? So the thinking was, let's undertake a rebellion. This was well planned. Let's undertake a rebellion and let's get to Florida. Florida is owned by the Spanish. There we will be free, or at least they were hoping they would be. Whether or not they would have been free when they got to Florida is surely up for debate, but that was the thinking, okay? All right, so this is kind of small. Hope you can read it. I kind of squeezed it onto one slide here. So here's the deal. There's 20 slaves led by a slave named Jemmy, not Jimmy, Jemmy. Now Jemmy is he's educated, he's literate. Okay. So he's a leader, right? They're going to break into the store. They're going to steal guns. They're going to steal gunpowder. They're going to kill the storekeepers. They're going to travel south. They're going to stop at plantations along the way. The rebellion's going to grow. It's going to grow to 60 to 100 slaves. They're going to kill several slave owners on the way, and it's somewhat brutal. They even kill some children and stuff like that. I mean, it's brutal. They're heading. They want to get to Spanish Florida. Okay, they don't make it. Right. Okay. Uh, once again, they're hoping to get to Spanish Florida because they want land, they want freedom that supposedly that would exist there. A local militia is going to rally and stop their advancement at the Adesto River, which is south of Charleston. I mean, they're getting to Georgia, right? They're getting to Georgia and then into Florida, the long hike, right? But they get halted at Adesto, and many of them are killed. Now, this is not, this is it is an uprising, right? Even when they're contacted by militia, there's a battle. There's still some uprising that are continuing, but the militia does eventually surround the rebels and slaughter them. And the ones they don't kill, they executed the next day, and they put their heads on display. Right? Put their heads on display. They put them on pikes, So as a warning to any slave, hey, you escape. This is what we're going to do to you. Okay. But this is the largest slave rebellion of the colonial era. 20 whites and 100 slaves will be killed. And I think, what's significant to point out about this is that there were attempts at rebellion, right? Slaves didn't just accept their fate, right? And this is just one I'm telling you about. But the reason why there weren't more, perhaps, is because they didn't typically result in the way that the slaves had intended. Typically, what resulted from these, one more slide to show you, is reduced freedoms, a more stricter slave environment. Now, first off, execution, heads on display. That's a pretty grave consequence. But the consequences of the Stono Rebellion made things worse for slaves in general in South Carolina and really throughout the South because these ideas spread. New slave code was passed. Slave patrols were expanded. Constant surveillance. Movement was restricted. Right, those opportunities to hire out your own labor, all those things can be restricted. There were some owners who didn't let them go to church anymore because, you learn about the Egyptian slaves and slaves escaping, and then slave owners themselves face fines if they did not control their slaves. So the typical result of rebellions is things getting tougher, right? Things getting tougher for slaves. And so that's why maybe they didn't occur more often. Okay. But then again, maybe it shows that slavery is so bad that despite these consequences, they still tried them. Okay. Okay, so I wanted to give you that on colonial slavery. So that gives you some good stuff to maybe put in an essay on labor, right? Not that you have to mention all of this, but you can pull some pieces out of it, right? So, one of your essay questions is going to deal with labor, okay? And so hopefully this will help you with that. I'll post this. Give me a question or comment back, and I'll give you 10 points for it. You may have to wait a little while for it to post, okay? Any questions? All right, kids, thanks for your attention. I'm going to end the meeting tomorrow. Tomorrow, I need to hear from you. I need to hear some of your opinions on this stuff. Okay, have a good day.